Well, the book is about, most Americans tend to assume that markets and democracy naturally go together. And the thesis of the book is that in countries with what I call a market-dominant minority, markets and democracy are not mutually reinforcing, because markets and democracy basically benefit different ethnic groups. So take Indonesia as an illustration. Free market policies in the 1980s and 1990s led to a situation in which the country's tiny 3% Chinese minority controlled an astounding 70% of the country's private economy. The introduction of democracy in 1998 produced a violent backlash. 5,000 homes and shops of ethnic Chinese were looted and burned. 2,000 people died. 150 Chinese women were raped. The wealthiest Chinese left the country, along with some $40 to $100 billion of ethnic Chinese-controlled capital, plunging the country into a crisis from which it has not recovered. So in countries with a market-dominant minority, and Indonesia is just one of many examples, markets and democracy benefit not just different people or different classes, but actually different ethnic groups. Markets make the resented minority richer and richer, while democracy increases the political power of the poor, frustrated, indigenous majority. And the result is almost invariably tremendous instability and very often violence. I tend to put indigenous in quotes because it's a perception. I mean, there is for example, the indigenous Indonesians are the Pribumi majority who felt that they were there first and that the ethnic Chinese are outsiders or invaders. Now, I put indigenous in quotes because many of the Indonesian Chinese have lived there for 4 generations. It's the same with Zimbabwe. I mean, the indigenous black majority is indigenous in a real sense, but many of the white Zimbabweans have lived there for, again, 4 generations. Well, actually, everybody from West Africa is familiar with this. So it's interesting that many Americans, including myself, was not aware of this. The West African countries, for example, Nigeria, there are many local, indigenous, disproportionately successful African ethnic groups also, for example, the Igbo in Nigeria. But most saliently, almost in virtually every West African country, there is a very small population of Lebanese, ethnic Lebanese, again, who came over sometimes 2 or 3 generations ago, and they are essentially the driving force and the link to global capitalism. Foreign investors do all the deals with them, and they are extremely disproportionately wealthy. They typically, in Sierra Leone, that I discuss at great length, until the rebels took over, the Lebanese minority essentially controlled the diamond industry, which was, and that's often true. Market-dominant minorities tend to control the country's most valuable natural resources, which is the crown jewels. Which is another reason that their dominance provokes such hatred and resentment. In general, I ask the question, I talk about countries outside the United States, and one thing I say is that the United States does not have a market-dominant minority at the national level. Whatever one occasionally hears about Koreans or Jews, the United States economy is not controlled by any ethnic minority, and I actually document that. If you look at the 10 wealthiest Americans, Bill Gates and the family, none of them belong to any identifiable ethnic group. However, I then get more specific and I say that actually if you look at particular regions or areas in the United States, you do see echoes of the same phenomenon. And yes, in Los Angeles and many of our inner cities, Korean Americans are essentially a market-dominant ethnic minority vis-a-vis the much poorer and much more populous African American majorities around them. And it's actually very similar because there's a sense of them being newcomers and outsiders that have come in to take away something that's not rightfully theirs. Because they are relative newcomers. And the Los Angeles riots that I discuss in the more recent instance in Brooklyn are very familiar. They follow a very similar pattern where the poor majorities of these neighborhoods are actually kind of whipped up and stirred into anger by demagogues. I mean, often politicians who play on ethnic hatred for their own advantage. My publisher. Not my idea, not my idea. As an academic, I don't think I would have such a stark title. My own title, I can't even remember what it was, but it was long and boring. I think it's because my work originally started off as, academic articles. Even my mother couldn't understand them, and I think they probably wanted to make people more aware that it's not that I'm not writing about distant phenomenon, but about events that really affect them, including I write about September 11th also, and the implications of all this for America. And that's something I'm actually proud of. I think that a lot of people are very bored of the debate about globalization. It's sort of going nowhere, and people are tired of it. And I don't even think it makes sense to talk about the right and the left when it comes to globalization. So I think that both globalization's critics and globalization's enthusiasts both make mistakes. They both overlook the ethnic dimensions of free market democracy. So I feel that my book is nonpartisan, or at least along traditional lines, and neither left nor right in any meaningful way. And it's about a phenomenon. The idea of a market-dominant ethnic minority is for not entirely bad reasons. I think it's one that is almost taboo in U.S. society. The idea of writing about an ethnic minority who would tend under free market conditions to dominate economically the indigenous majority around them. So I think it's a topic that's not been addressed by either side. So it's not political that way. Now, by the way, I don't think it should be taboo, because the idea of a market-dominant minority is not to be equated with inherent entrepreneurialism. I mean, I write about market-dominant minorities who owe their market dominance to colonialism or apartheid, like the whites in South Africa. It has the fact that they are, a very small portion of the population, 14%, and have historically controlled all of the best land and all of the major conglomerates, owes principally to the fact that they didn't let the majority vote or live in humane conditions for over a century. I am a professor at the Yale Law School. Yes, actually, I went to law school, I passed the bar, and I practiced for 4 years on Wall Street at a major international law firm. I am, I'm ethnic Chinese. I was born in Champaign, Illinois. My parents were both born in China, but they left China with their families for the Philippines when they were young children. And most of my relatives are still in the Philippines. For economic reasons, around 1936-37, they were from a poor province, Fujian province. It's no longer so poor. But many people from that province at that time left. They took a boat and they headed straight, and many of them went to the Philippines. Well, my parents actually eloped to MIT in 1961. I was born in 1962. My father is also an academic. They came over for advanced degrees at MIT, and then my father went to complete his PhD at the University of Illinois, and my parents now live in Berkeley, California. My father is they're probably watching this show. My father is a professor at Berkeley, teaches chaos theory, and travels a lot. He's an electrical engineer, but he works a lot in computers and mathematics, and I probably shouldn't try to explain. I lived for just a few years, then I spent 8 years in Indiana, where my father taught at Purdue. So my 3 sisters and I lived in Indiana for 8 years, and then we moved to Berkeley, California. And then my father received an offer to go to Berkeley, so we then moved to Berkeley, California, where I spent another 8 years. No, that's where my parents wanted me to go, but I went to Harvard. Well, which part of it? Leaving the family for... well, we always worked hard. 3 younger sisters. I think, in some ways, my immediate family, the history of my immediate family is probably a fairly typical immigrant story. My parents came over. My father was from a very wealthy family. But he left all that, and my mother was not. She was from a poor intellectual family. So when they came over to the United States, they were penniless. They really had no money, no heat in Boston. So it was just very natural. We all knew we had to work hard, and we were all good students. One is a lawyer in DC. Another is a MD, PhD, or actually a postdoc at Harvard. She's a doctor and a scientist. And my youngest sister lives with my parents, and she is 10 years younger than I am. She has Down syndrome. She's the family favorite. I actually never imagined that it would be this kind of book. I started off just as an academic, writing academic law review articles about the relationship between market reforms, democratic reforms, and ethnic conflict. So I produced 3 law review articles, and then I thought that I would perhaps put it together. Many people suggested that I do so. So I put together a proposal originally for Oxford University Press, and it had the proposal was 3,000 pages long and had 2,000 footnotes. And through a series of coincidences, a friend suggested that perhaps I should have an agent look at it. And I have a great agent, and they suggested that my agent kept asking me, is there anything personal in this? And this is only a year and a half ago, before I started writing the book. And answering honestly at the time, I said, no, there was nothing personal in this, because I think for me the whole academic project has been precisely to depersonalize everything. I'm writing about complicated and controversial subjects, so for every fact I drop a footnote and substantiate it with empirical evidence, and the last thing I've wanted is for it to be subjective and personal. But as I've thought about it, the book has obviously changed, as probably for every author. Of course, it's about what I know and my own background, in a sense. In 1994, I had just started as an academic as a professor at Duke, and I had started to write about these issues already, but I received a phone call from my mother. I was at Duke and she was in California, and she told me that my aunt, my father's twin sister, Leona, his name is Leon, had been murdered in the Philippines. She was killed by her chauffeur. And my aunt and my whole family in the Philippines are part of the very, very economically dominant and entrepreneurial 1% Chinese minority in the Philippines. And her chauffeur was part of the largely impoverished, much more populous ethnic Filipino majority. And so my mother told me about that. She lived by herself in a beautiful home in Manila. Many of my relatives still live in Manila. Well, there was actually no dispute. 2 maids immediately confessed that they had actually been accomplices. I mean, it was premeditated, and a few minutes before the murder, they testified that he was sharpening the knife, and after the murder, he reported to them that their employer was dead, and the police were notified, and sort of the usual things happened, but the murderer was never apprehended, and both of the maids were released. And part of this has to do with the fact that, first of all, kidnapping of ethnic Chinese in the Philippines is extremely common, and very rarely are the suspects apprehended. And part of this is, I think, because of the intense resentment against the ethnic Chinese, and the fact that the police and the security forces are largely, are all ethnic Filipino, and they're not that motivated. In some ways, I think there's a lot of sympathy, not necessarily for the murder, but for the circumstances that would lead people to do such things. Well, it was interesting. The chauffeur apparently took some jewels, some money, and I asked my uncle, were there any developments in the murder case? And the answer was no. It's been closed. This is when I asked why, he said this is the Philippines. This is not America. So I actually got copies of the police report, and interestingly, under motive, there was essentially just one word, and it was revenge, which was striking for me because it could have been robbery, it could have been something else. Well, that's an interesting question. I think revenge, for my own view, is a combination. Revenge for feelings of humiliation and powerlessness. Many of the Chinese Filipino families have many servants, and it's a very lopsided situation. The businesses are virtually all dominated by ethnic Chinese, along with a very small sort of Spanish aristocratic class. All of the peasants in the Philippines are Filipino. All of the maids and the servants and the chauffeurs are Filipino. And when foreign investors come to do investment deals, they deal with the Chinese. So I think it's, revenge is a theme of the book, I think. It's an act of revenge rooted in tremendous feelings of anger and envy and grievance and humiliation. Well, this is a tricky question that is not the main focus of the book, but many people ask me this. First of all, it's very complex, and I definitely do not think it is a genetic reason or necessarily even a cultural reason. Groups can be market dominant in one context and not in another. For example, the Chinese in China were market dormant for many generations under communist China. As to why the Chinese minorities of all Southeast Asia, I mean, even right now, Burma, Malaysia, Thailand, I think part of it has to do with the immigrant origins, that instilled a sense of hard work. Part of it has to do with family and, I guess, cultural considerations. But in addition, one thing I try to bring out in the book, part of it is also favoritism. So it's kind of circular because you have this entrepreneurial group that starts off and has disproportionate entrepreneurial skills. And often, in the case of Ferdinand Marcos, an indigenous leader will actually go into cahoots with this market-dominant minority and then engage in a symbiotic relationship where, I'll protect you, I'll give you these government franchises and licenses, you make a lot of money and you kick it back to me. So I guess the answer is that part of the reason for the extraordinary market dominance of the Chinese is entrepreneurialism, hard work, and I don't know the reasons for that, but at the same time, in some cases, also it's the legacy of colonialism and crony capitalism. Malaysia is much smaller than Indonesia. The one important factor is religion. The Malay majority in Malaysia and the Indonesian majority in Indonesia are principally Muslim, and the Chinese are not. And so one professor, a friend of mine from Singapore, was just joking, but he said it's the pork factor, that Muslims don't eat pork and Chinese eat pork all the time, and therefore it's impossible to get along. And he was just being facetious, but I think that religion certainly has played a role. And an interesting counterexample is Thailand, where this is the Southeast Asian country where there has been the most assimilation and even intermarriage. And I think that most people agree that one of the factors is the fact that the Thai are Buddhist and not Muslim. And this has made assimilation between the ethnic Thais and the Chinese easier. Yes. I saw my aunt on many occasions in the Philippines, and I don't know if I met this chauffeur. I think not, but I've often wondered that. I've met many chauffeurs. I've often wondered if I had. Well, I start off with an anecdote. I was actually visiting at another university, and I have a colleague or a friend who was writing about the Russian privatization process. He and some co-authors had been very involved, actually important advisors to the government, and he was finishing up an article describing the fiasco of the Russian privatization process, describing how the lack of kind of careful planning and kind of laws against, anti-competitive behavior, laws against insider trading, how this had led to the looting and chaos that ensued in Russia. But something about his article struck me. So I went and asked my friend, I said, is it possible that these 7 oligarchs and many of the principal players in the privatization process, is it possible that they were Jewish? And his reaction was to immediately say, no, I don't think so. And I then said, but it's interesting, if you look at their names, and he snapped back, you can't tell anything from names. And I was taken aback, and I felt bad. But then actually just a few months later, one book came out, Chrystia Freeland's book, The Sale of the Century, in which she documented through first-hand interviews the profiles of the 7 oligarchs. And in fact, it turns out that 6 of the 7 people most commonly called the oligarchs, who came to control most of Russia's natural resources during the 90s, were in fact Jewish. Well, this is the term that they use in Russia for this small group of people who controlled most of the natural resources, and then through their economic power also exerted enormous political influence. For example, to use one of their words, guaranteeing Yeltsin's re-election. They also controlled the media, and so they poured huge amounts of money into Yeltsin's campaign and were rewarded for that. Well, this is tricky. I mean, some of the oligarchs now, their role models are the Carnegies. They say that, we used to be robber barons, but now it's time for us to, a few of them have actually turned to philanthropy, and I think that's a great thing. It's a complicated question whether, what the state of their democratic institutions are right now. Wealth is still very disproportionately concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number. Yes, at least sort of in the late 90s, I would say that these 6 or 7 oligarchs controlled, I think, 50 to 60% of the natural resource wealth. I think I'm getting those numbers right. And if you look at Fortune or Forbes, the list of the wealthiest people in the world, you'll see that, that includes 3 or 4 of these Jewish oligarchs. But as to the state of democracy, I think it's not, there are different analyses about what Putin is doing right now. There was tremendous anti-Semitism. The free speech and kind of instant democratization led to lots of things, lots of positive things, but they also led to just a burst of demagogic behavior. And, the Communist Party leaders explicitly spewing anti-Semitism, campaigning on anti-Semitic platforms. There's a new party that has just come into existence that is explicitly organized around taking back the wealth from the greedy Jewish oligarchs. So I think that's one very negative side of the transition. Well, the background to this is I taught a law and development seminar a few years ago, actually 3 or 4 years ago, and I had an excellent student from Bolivia. I did not know at the time that he was from the elite classes. It makes perfect sense now if you think about it. Well, I call him Augusto Delgado. No, he's related to many of the presidents, actually, and I gave him that option. But he raised his hand in my seminar and said, he was a fantastic student and I loved him, but he basically challenged me. He said, Professor Chua, my country is a direct counterexample to your thesis. All these bad things don't happen when you have markets and democracy and a market-dominant minority. In my country, it's a very similar situation to the one you describe in Zimbabwe or Indonesia. We have a very small, light-skinned minority, about 3% of the population, control virtually everything. They control the economy, politics, culture, all the natural resources, and are the foreign investors' partners. And then we have 65% of the population, the majority, are impoverished, in many cases illiterate, Aymara and Quechua Amerindians. But what he said was, in my country, you would never have an ethnically based populist movement. You would never have an ethno-nationalist movement where politicians were campaigning on anti-white campaigns. And I asked him why, and he said, because ethnicity has no mobilizing power in my country. It has to do, he was very smart and very self-conscious. He said it has to do with a bad history of racism. But most Indians or Amerindians in my country would rather identify themselves as peasants than Indios, because that's a derogatory term. So the story is that 2 years later, this is just actually in 2001, he emailed me from La Paz, where he was a very successful lawyer and political commentator, and he wrote to essentially take back his words. And he said, you know, this is really the time to visit. It's amazing. Things it's globalization, and it's having extraordinary effects on my country. And for the first time in recent history, an Aymara leader is actually generating support among the indigenous populations on an explicitly racist or ethnically Indian-based identity platform. So saying whites should get out, whites should leave the country, the land belongs to the Aymaras and the Quechuas. And it was very stark, and it was also, I think, a direct example of the collision between free market policies that benefited the people like my student and that well-educated cosmopolitan elite group, and then globalization and democratization that not only empowers the majority, but also, you know, things spread. There had been an Indian movement in Ecuador, and through cell phones and the radio and the television, these kinds of ethnic anger can spread too, along with capitalism and democracy. So I visited La Paz shortly after that email, just to see, just to kind of see for myself. At the time, well, now they're 10 and 6 at the time, Sophia and Louisa, or Lulu. They really hated it. Well, La Paz was fine. La Paz was fine. It was beautiful. As soon as we got there, the warnings were all right. Everybody got headaches. The altitude, it's stunningly beautiful, because the city just rises out of a crater. I've never seen anything like it. But it is very, very high. It's a lot of radiation, and we all felt enervated, no energy. And they felt the same way. Everybody had headaches. But then after La Paz, where we were treated beautifully, we met these exquisitely well-educated and thoughtful members of the universities. I gave some lectures, and that was very enjoyable. But then we set out for the rest of Bolivia on our own, and underestimated, I think it's fair to say, the level of underdevelopment in that country. I mean, we were stranded for days in places with no heat and no sewage, and at one point we had to drive through a river to get to the airport, quite a raging river. So it was interesting for them to see. He's also a professor at Yale. I teach international business transactions, and a class called Contracts, and then a seminar that changes. This, currently it's called Globalization and Law. Sometimes it's called Markets, Democracy, and Ethnic Conflict. It's where I really get to know and learn from students who are from many different countries, and many of my stories and much of my information actually comes from students from different countries. Maylan is well, it's not her real name, but it's a friend of mine who is from mainland China, grew up and just left mainland China to marry a native New Yorker, and she and I were at a Manhattan dinner party, and shortly after September 11th, and this was, well, her presence created a huge argument that was very striking for me, so I report it in one of my chapters, which she asserted with great confidence that 99% of the people in China approved of and were happy about the September 11th attacks. And this prompted a furious outcry among the American guests. I mean, one guest, I guess, properly asked, 99%? I mean, what kind of pollster produced that statistic? It just seemed not quite right. And her response was, you know, let's not get hung up on numbers. Face it, Americans are hated all over the world, and deal with it. And then this conversation deteriorated. Well, market-dominant minorities, first of all, in the book, most of the book, the market-dominant minorities I write about are within individual nations. So, you know, the whites in Zimbabwe or Namibia, or whites in Brazil, or the Croatians in the former Yugoslavia. Now, the impact of them, it's interesting. It's again, there's a lot of subtlety here. Market-dominant minorities are often the principal engines of economic growth in a country. This is certainly true of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. So their economic impact in some ways has been tremendous. They've generated tremendous economic growth over the years. On the other hand, their presence is a source of enormous instability, especially when you combine it with rapid democratization, because the situation of having a situation of where the rich people are not just rich, but they are viewed as ethnic outsiders stealing the nation's wealth is just incredibly destabilizing. So I actually think that market-dominant minorities are, I say that they're the Achilles heel of free market democracy in the non-Western world. Now, to go back to your question about the United States, that's by analogy, whereas, you know, in most of the book I write about individual countries, I suggest by analogy that at the global level, you see a very similar phenomenon. Basically, the United States has become the world's market-dominant minority. And the analogy has its limits. I mean, obviously, Americans are not an ethnic group. I mean, we're a melting pot, and nor is there democracy at the global level. On the other hand, you see just the same kinds of dynamics. I mean, the Americans are 4% of the world's total population, and yet we wield, just like the Chinese in Indonesia or the Lebanese in West Africa, we wield just astonishingly disproportionate economic power relative to our numbers. And from China to the Middle East to France, we are perceived, I think correctly, as the principal engines and principal beneficiaries of global capitalism. You know, we dominate global markets in every respect, technological, financial, cultural. And I think for our extraordinary market dominance and our seeming global invincibility, we have earned the envy and fear and deep resentment of much of the rest of the world. Yes, I put that in because that at maybe not now, but at various points in recent history, Bill Gates has, you know, controlled as much as 40% of the rest of the American population put together. And what's very interesting there is that Americans don't hate Bill Gates, and they've never wanted to lynch him or confiscate his assets. In fact, when the government went after him, I think a poll that I report suggested that many Americans just wanted him to be left alone so he could go back and make money. And what's interesting is that that's because the United States does not have a market-dominant minority. I think it would be very different, and I actually propose this as a thought experiment, for Americans to imagine what it would be like if Bill Gates and, you know, the 10 other wealthiest Americans were all, you know, pick an ethnic group, Arab or Chinese or Indian, and then further imagine that the rest of the population, the majority, was, you know, lived in entrenched poverty and had experienced no upward mobility for generations. I think that's the basic dynamic that characterizes much of the developing world. I mean, we have rags to riches stories here. You know, if you ask a poor person in Arkansas why they're Republican or like Bill Gates, and their answer is they think that their son could be Bill Clinton or Bill Gates. And that's just not the case in countries where the rich people, where all the wealthy people belong to a different ethnic group, a small ethnic minority. Well, in Southeast Asia, that's exactly what the Chinese have done. So there, yes, the Chinese were immigrants there and pretty much became very dominant. Well, interestingly, the Asian communities are fascinating. There's, for example, a very small but very successful Japanese minority in Peru. Now, they're not market dominant because I use a very strong definition. They don't control the economy, but they're disproportionately successful. I think not. Although, again, I think I understand your question. I think the United States is very unique in the myth or the dream of upward mobility or rags to riches is something that is, I think, very unique, in some ways idiosyncratic to the United States. I mean, even in our relatively prosperous Western European allies, that myth of rags to riches, or the dream of rags to riches, is not so robust. I think people in the United States really believe in it, or a disproportionate number of Americans really believe in it, and I think that's because of our history and reality in some sense. Right. Yes. So at the world level, you see what is going on, sort of analogous to what's happening within nations. And that is that global markets have done a lot of good. I mean, I'm very in favor of global capitalism. I think in some ways that some form of market-generated growth is the only hope for developing countries. But at the same time that you see an explosion of growth and what you also see is enormous inequalities of wealth, and this does have to do with a phenomenon of market-dominant minorities. Sometimes all boats are lifted. In other words, everybody in the nation gets wealthier. I think a lot of the globalization debate kind of gets stuck in that. But all of the empirical evidence that I have carefully looked at from the World Bank and elsewhere show that in many cases global markets do lift all boats. But the phenomenon of market-dominant minorities becomes very important here, because it's perception that's important. And if people watching their televisions and looking around them see that it seems like the sudden new crop of billionaires all seem to be Lebanese or white or ethnic Chinese, they don't rejoice in World Bank surveys that show that their per capita income is increased by 2 cents a day. So it's a double-edged sword. Well, I'm a great admirer of Thomas Friedman. Yes, I certainly read his columns, and I think he's just a very thoughtful and erudite person, especially when it comes to the Middle East. I do disagree with some of his recommendations. On the other hand, I think that he has changed his views after September 11th, so that our views are much closer. Well, I think that in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, he presented a picture in which markets and democracy, working hand in hand, would transform the world into, peace-loving, prosperous nations and filled with kind of happy co-citizens. And then in the process, not even subtext, but quite explicitly, ethnic conflict and religious extremism would be swept away. And I think if you look at the history of the world in the last 20 years, just the opposite has happened. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have seen, alongside the spread of markets and democracy, we've seen increasing ethnic conflict, the rise of militant Islam, confiscations, calls for renationalization, and 2 genocides of magnitudes unprecedented since the Nazi Holocaust. So, and I think that, I argue that it's because whenever a market-dominant minority is present, markets and democracy are not mutually reinforcing, but on a collision course. I think that one of the great challenges going forward is to find ways to spread the benefits of global markets to more than just a handful of market-dominant minorities, 1% here, 2% here, and their foreign investor partners. Well, I actually propose, I don't think there are any easy solutions, but I do think, again, in some ways learning from the example of the United States, I think the idea of stakeholding, people rebel against markets and vote in anti-market leaders when they feel that they have no stake in the market. They feel like, free markets benefit a different ethnic group or foreign investors, like Venezuela. So the majority in free and fair elections vote in a anti-market, U.S. leader whose policies of nationalization and extremism, would just stun Americans. People can't understand how anyone could vote for that. But he campaigned, Hugo Chavez, a former paratrooper, swept to power in Venezuela, doing exactly what I predict, which is targeting the market-dominant minority in his country, basically the 20% Mantuanos, or the kind of whites, that's in quotations because this is a very artificial term for people of European features and European pretensions, but he targeted these oil-controlling oligarchs, he called them, and he campaigned on a pro-poor, pro-Pardo platform. Pardo is the term for the brown-skinned 80% majority that lives beneath the poverty line. And he said, described Cuba as a sea of happiness. He attacked the United States. He attacked the oligarchs as squealing pigs and degenerates. And they voted for him. And it was very ethnic. It was explicitly ethnic. He called himself the Indian from Barinas. His biographer focused on his Chinese-looking eyes and thick lips. And people said, we want to vote for somebody who looks like us, who's one of us. And the results, I think, have been disastrous. No. I've been in many arguments about this. It's obviously, especially after, this was shortly after September 11th, and emotions run very high. She, I think, represented the position of many people in the developing world, which is, while not, certainly not necessarily condoning the attacks, she was nonetheless very sympathetic towards the terrorists and understanding of their motives for doing such a thing. And that particular conversation just degenerated into charges of hypocrisy against the United States, and followed by, on the part of the American guests, the usual, what country isn't self-interested? Which country has done more for the rest of the world than the United States? I haven't calculated the costs and benefits, but I think that, yes, I think that the United States has done an enormous amount of good, and that's one of the sort of the tragedies of or the difficulties about market-dominant minorities. This is the same thing with the Chinese in Indonesia. The 3% population there in the 80s were really responsible for jump-starting that economy, and they generated a huge amount of growth. And yet the perception among the pribumi majority was that they were siphoning off the wealth of the nation, and they were actually hated and scapegoated. So I think there was a parallel there. I detail in the book, I think that when speaking about anti-Americanism, it's important to be very careful. The world is not a monolithic place, and there are many different forms of anti-Americanism. So I've written about, there's what I call friendly anti-Americanism, and I describe the reactions to the United States in countries like Canada or Great Britain or Australia. And this, in some ways, is just kind of playful resentment. I think that's where the vapidly materialistic quote comes from. And then I also discuss anti-Americanism in Europe, which is, I think, increasingly intense. Well, this falls into the category of friendly anti-Americanism, actually. After, I had a lot of research assistants kind of trying to assess the situation, and I think a lot of Americans were surprised. Again, these are not people who necessarily condoned the attacks, but somehow understood it, and again, that the perception even in countries like Australia or Great Britain is that the United States is, as the sole superpower, is just too powerful, and displays a lack of concern for other countries. I think those, actually, a number have closed, but yes, that's the statistic as of recently. Well, I actually think that statistic shows the love-hate relationship that is characteristic of many market-dominant, the reactions towards many market-dominant minorities. On the one hand, while people are criticizing the United States, many people from the developing world are just desperate to come here. In fact, a friend of mine put it recently that the view of Americans held by many poor people in the developing world is basically, Americans, get out and take me with you. And I think that's that's part of what's happening now in France. It's a little bit different. I think that the French elites are concerned that American culture is having a disproportionate influence in France. Presently, no. Presently, no. Like the United States, at the national level, none of the advanced Western European countries, or for that matter, and I think this is very interesting, any of the East Asian tigers, none of these countries have a market-dominant minority. So in some ways, I think that's sort of very telling that countries with a market-dominant minority have it much harder, that the tension between markets and democracy, which can be overcome in other contexts where ethnicity is not a factor, becomes catalyzed in countries where the rich are viewed as ethnic outsiders. Well, the Middle East is a very, it's a tricky region, and so much else is going on there. I mean, obviously, there are religious factors, questions of colonialism and neo-colonialism and land claims. So I am just observing one pattern among many, one dynamic, and that is that at sort of, again, at the regional level, actually within the individual Arab states, there are no market-dominant minorities. So again, those are countries without market-dominant minorities. But at the regional level, it's also very stark that Israeli Jews are kind of a regional market-dominant minority. They're just a tiny, again, 5.2 million compared to over 221 million. And Israel is viewed as almost like a Western enclave. I think I have the statistics in there. The per capita income, I believe, is 17,000 compared to, I think, 7,000 in Saudi Arabia, and maybe 600 in Egypt, maybe 300 in Yemen. So it's extremely, I wasn't aware of this until recently, that I wasn't aware of the enormous economic disparity in that region. Well, again, this is a huge topic, and others more expert have written about it. I mean, there's a lot going on there with foreign policy and oil and corrupt, repressive regimes. One thing that I think is happening is that the leaders in many of the Arab states, to deflect criticism away from themselves, are deliberately fomenting and, you know, they're deliberately fomenting anti-Israeli and anti-American sentiment precisely to kind of target the criticism elsewhere. And throughout the Middle East, the Israeli Jews are viewed, a very common way of describing them is as a Western colonizing force. They're actually often described as the last wave of Western colonization, and then backed by the United States. Well, these are more products of globalization. Well, I think that people have a distorted view of the United States, because what do they see? What is the United States for the rest of the world? They see our president, they see our supermodels, they see our multinationals, and that's the slice of America that they see. So it's, you know, on the one hand, Hollywood creates this image of glamour, this idea that everybody here lives these lives of indolence and luxury, when in fact, you know, many Americans are not like that and work very hard. And so I do think that's part of the feelings of envy and desire that global markets perpetuate. Yes, this is one of the misunderstandings that I frequently get about my book. People ask me if I'm, you know, against anti-globalization, and the answer is definitely not. I'm very much in favor of globalization. I don't know, I think it would be futile to be against it. And they also ask whether I'm anti-markets or anti-democracy, and I am very much in favor of promoting markets and democracy globally, both of them. But there are many different versions of free market democracy, and I think that we are exporting the wrong version. In fact, I think we've been, for the last 20 years, promoting a caricature of free market democracy. So on the market side, there is no Western nation today that has anything close to a laissez-faire system. I mean, we have progressive taxation and antitrust laws and Social Security. But for the last 20 years, we've, you know, been urging poor countries to adopt a kind of bare-knuckled version of capitalism that Europe and the U.S. abandoned long ago. And it's the same with democracy. You know, for the last 20 years, the U.S. government has been urging the poor countries of the world to hold elections, to have, you know, implement immediate universal suffrage. But yes, in our own history was one in which we disenfranchised the poor for generations. And more importantly, I mean, I think that's out of the question. You know, property or exclusions from the suffrage, I'm not in favor of that. But I think more importantly, democracy in the West means much more than just unrestrained majority rule, which I think is what we've been promoting. I think democracy is also about constitutionalism and minority protections and property protections, human rights. I think a lot more thought is needed than just shipping out ballot boxes for elections, which brought people like Milosevic to power. Thank you for having me.